So, as I told you, the rather astonishing news, this was during conflict of interest number 1, that there were some people who wanted to see me while I was doing these lectures. So here I am. So I'll just do a couple of quick minutes on the first slide. Please note this is conflict of interest number 2 that you have turned on. There is a conflict of interest number 1, which I strongly recommend that you watch first. And please, please, please do this as well. What comes with this course is there comes an ebook, and the ebook therefore explains everything. And so if you are having problems downloading me, or you are having problems understanding me because I'm from Scotland, then please download the ebook, and you can always contact us. The book's on the website, it'll be in the blog, and then we'll put it everywhere. We put the video as well. So, and it's free. Everything is free as ever. Right, this is conflict of interest number 2. Part of our series on fraud and corruption. Because we do public financial management here at ME Fieldings, and that's our bread and butter. It comes in all the time, it being anti-corruption. So anti-corruption, fraud prevention is a big part of everything because we work with government. And as you may know, we've just come back from 5 months with the UN working on fraud prevention and anti-corruption. In part number 1, therefore, we looked at what it is. So we gave you some definitions and this idea of primary and secondary aims. Then we looked at why it's important. And we also talked about the fact that developing nations now have this idea as well of civil society and the public, and more countries are finding that their general public will not actually tolerate corruption. So we have this idea there, and also with conflict of interest, this idea that with corruption something bad has happened. With conflict of interest, it hasn't happened yet. So we're identifying a conflict of interest, and it depends where people go with it there. Please watch part number 1 when we talk about this idea, and also the idea of financial gains and non-financial gains. So people may do favours for people just for the prestige, or just to show that they can and they have a bit of power. There can be political aims. There can also, we see in real life that there can be things like charitable aims as well. And so, conflicts of interest, what they are, the idea that we have an individual who has 2 conflicting sets of interests, one with his employer, which is pretty much always the government as far as we're concerned, and the second one was, let's assume it's a supplier or something like that. And the reasons why these things may arise, and the reason why they may use their position and their power. And it may not always be money, though money tends to come into it pretty much at some point of the equation. Watch part number 1, download the book, it's on the website, and like us on Facebook as well. We like that too. Thank you. So, having talked about what is conflict of interest and the fact that we can all see how it arises, and to be honest, I think in 99% of situations it arises for normal commercial reasons. It's not because people are going out their way to steal money. No, I guess in some situations that does happen. The question, therefore, for an organisation, bearing in mind that we're looking at public financial management, so therefore for a government-type organisation, the question, therefore, is how do you deal with it? So when you're in the situation that you're writing policies for governments on things like conflict of interest, the question becomes then, how are we going to deal with it? What do you actually physically do? What do you write on a piece of paper? Well, there's 2 different ways of going through this, or 2 different approaches to this. And this is called here mainstreaming as a management tool, it says on my slide. Right, that means basically that you do everything internally. So you set up an ethics department, so you have an ethics group, and the conflict of interest will be brought to the attention of the ethics group, and then that group will decide what they do with it, what an appropriate action is. So what are we actually going to do? The alternative to doing everything in-house and doing it yourself is doing it out of house. So therefore you can have some what are called independent ethics commissions, which is a very, very grandiose phrase, that you bring in some consultants or some people from outside your organisation, and they will decide themselves. The advantages of doing it yourself are that you build up a corporate culture, because the people are likely to be much more constant within your organisation. In other words, the people who are making the decisions, the ethics committee you set up internally, will work with your company. They know how your company works, they know what the culture is, they know how production processes or whatever work, and so therefore you get much more of this idea of consistency and a better understanding of the situation. When we bring in independence from outside, you may find that particularly if you contract a company, that the people making the decisions change. And so therefore in that situation, we don't get the same level of understanding and the same levels of consistency. Right, other things, that the reason that you would bring those people in though is that if they are outside of the organisation, first and foremost, particularly with the government, this idea we talked about in number one, in conflicts of interest lecture number one, was this idea of public perception. So if you are outside of the organisation, then you have the perception that they are independent and that they can't be touched. Now, there's a long list of these things where consultants have come in and have given the answer that a certain individual wants. But in principle, your perception hopefully will be that your consultants will be more independent. You'd have to look at the costing as well. A second reason is that it may be cheaper because you only have to go to these guys and you only have to use them at that point in time when you actually need them. Whereas if you have a full-time ethics committee, you're paying people, and potentially, unless you're taking people off of their other jobs, you're paying people to sit and do nothing. You would hope that this isn't going to be sort of a daily occurrence. So it may be cheaper. Finally, external consultants may bring certain specialist skills with them. So things like negotiation skills. You might even bring independent people in from the union or something. But these people have certain specific types of, labour relations skills or other kind of skills which you don't permanently have and need in your organisation. Right, therefore there is no correct answer to this. You have to decide. Do you want it in-house, where people know the culture and how the company works? Do you want to take it outside, where certainly you would hope that the perception would be that it will be more independent and there may be some extra skills? You have to decide. It's up to you. And the company will decide itself based on if the culture of the organisation is one of confidentiality and not wanting transparency, then you'll certainly want to keep it in-house. So we're starting to get a little bit more down into the nitty-gritty now, and we've got slides number 3 and 4 that are actually very, very similar, and kind of to some degree they're going to cover the same ground. But let's start with slide number 3. Right, slide number 3, just look at the heading first of all. Slide number 3 says eliminating, mitigating or managing conflicts of interest. So if you remember our scenario, I work for the government and I am responsible for purchasing school buses. My son works for a company and that company is in the retail trade and it sells school buses. Right, let's just run through these and talk about each of them in order. Right, the first one is disclosure. So this relates to me. I work for the government, therefore I have to disclose where there are conflicts of interest. So notice first of all that this falls on me. The government actually wants me to come forward and say, look, my name is Mark, I'm involved in buying school buses and my son is involved in selling school buses. So I make that voluntary disclosure. Okay, let's change that for a second. Let's not call it voluntary. I make that disclosure. There's two different ways of doing this. You can either do it on an ad hoc basis. So in other words, every single time that there arises a problem with conflict of interest, I have to come forward and make disclosure. Or what can happen is I have to make periodic disclosure. So I will get a form to fill in every 6 months or every 12 months. So if, for example, you work for an accountancy firm and you're an auditor, you have to fill in every 6 or 12 months a form that lists all of the shares that you own to make sure that you're not auditing a firm that you own shares in. So we get this idea of disclosure. So how is the government dealing with potential conflicts of interest? It's making its staff, therefore me, disclose either on an ad hoc basis or whenever something happens, or on a periodic basis every 12, every 6 months, conflicts of interest that there are. So in your policies, so we're talking about policies now, you will have a disclosure policy. Point number 1, disclosure. I think that's quite straightforward. Secondly, training. So what will happen therefore is that all members of staff who are in any position where they are purchasing goods or where there are any potential conflicts of interest, they will have to go on regular training. And the training therefore will be ethics training, anti-corruption training, and it will cover the company's own handbook, it will cover legislation, and also it will cover ethics and generally how you behave yourself. So there will be periodic training. And many organizations make their staff go on this training, particularly things like banks and so on, when you're giving people advice, lending money. So you'll go on the training every 1, 2, 3 years, whatever the staff handbook says, whatever the company policy is. So we get this idea, therefore, of regular training, which will be undertaken by members of staff. Right, monitoring and modification. Monitoring, in this case, usually will be carried out by an independent body. So therefore I come forward and I say, look guys, I'm up here, I'm running this contract, I'm managing a contract for buying and servicing 100 school buses. My son works for the company, I'd like to give them the contract, or they're tendering, not even I want to give them the contract. And that process will be monitored. So some independent body will come in. Remember we talked about our consultants or our independent ethics commissioners will come in. And they will monitor that situation to ensure that there is no potential for conflict of interest. Or rather, we know that there is conflict of interest, so therefore they will monitor the situation to make sure that nothing untoward is happening. There's no contract modifications that result in extra sums of cash, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. If during the monitoring they discover that there is, then usually what will happen is they will have the right to make some form of modification. So they can modify the contract, or they can ask the supplier to ensure that my son is not involved, or they can remove me, but they can change, if not the legal contract, and that may be difficult to do in some countries, but if they can't change the contract itself, they will modify the process, and so the process will remove that. So we've had disclosure. Company has a policy of asking its staff to disclose. Training, staff go on training. Monitoring and modification. So staff therefore will be monitored and processes will be modified if there is some concern over conflicts of interest. So next one down is disqualification. Disqualification can work in two ways. So either I will, as an employee of the government, will be disqualified. So therefore what will happen is that the government will say, Mark, you can have nothing to do with this contract whatsoever. You need to be moved from the position that you have power over. So therefore we build what's called Chinese walls, so you're not allowed near it. An alternative to this is that we say that the supplier is not eligible to tender. So therefore the supplier that has my son as an employee will not be eligible to tender for this contract. So basically I stay in my place, but my son has to go and he has to be removed. So this idea of disqualification. In real life, I understand that in most organizations what they do is they disqualify the company which is doing the tendering. So the supplier will be withdrawn on grounds of perceived problems with conflict of interest. So that's at number 4, disqualification. Breathe, 1, 2, 3. Right, divestiture. Oh, that's difficult to say. Divestiture. Right. This is the situation where I have something and I am forced to get rid of it. So I don't think they'll ask me to get rid of my son. But let's assume now that I am responsible for purchasing 100 school buses and I own 10% of the shares in the company, and that company will sell the school buses. So now my son is gone, forget my son. But now what happens is I own shares in this company which is tendering. Right, what will happen in that situation is that the government will come to me, my ministry will come to me and they'll say, Mark, before you can do this, we have no problem with the company, they look good, but you have to sell your shares. So you have to get rid of your shares. So this is this idea of divesting, so getting rid of the thing that causes the conflict of interest. My ownership of those shares, now, not having a son, my ownership of those shares causes the conflict of interest. So they will say, okay, Mark, you have to get rid of those shares, and by getting rid of those shares, then what will happen is that the conflict of interest ceases. So you get rid of the shares. There are deeper questions as to, well, you have to get rid of the shares because they're going to win a big contract so the price goes up. But that's your basic point therefore. So we get rid of that relationship, that item which causes the conflict of interest. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's divestiture. And number 6 is severance of relationship. Severance of relationship is probably the most serious, And I'm guessing that in real life you would use this when you were pretty certain that someone has been doing something that they shouldn't. So severance of relationship here means that the guy is fired. So they come to me and they say, you should not have asked this company to tender. You've done it deliberately because you want your son to get a big bonus. Thank you and goodbye. You are fired. So severance of relationships. At some point the relationship is severed. Or the company could fire my son, or they could pack him off to, some distribution center in a foreign country. But this is probably the most serious. As we go through these things, having to disclose, training, those ones are fairly light in terms of the government making me do these things. Monitoring and modification or possible disqualification, well, I still get to keep my job, but I can't have anything really much to do with the contract, or I'm being watched all the time. Divestiture, I got to sell my shares. It's probably still not the end of the world. And finally, severance of relationship. That's pretty serious, yeah. Right, that's slide number 3. What we're going to do now is we're going to come on to slide number 4. Slide number 3, I took that is the actual policy up on the internet for the Stanford School of Medicine, which I took. That's a nice one because there's nice little explanations there. The one which is number 4 is for, I think it's UNFPA, one of the UN agencies. So the idea of slide number 3 and 4 is it's the same topic. It's just how 2 different organizations look at the same topic. If you go to the free book, hope you've downloaded your free book from the internet, then you will see that there's more given to you on the internet. So we've got Deutsche Bank and we've got some South African insurance company as well to try and give you some geographical spread. So slide number 3, slide number 4 is going to be very similar, but just a different organization. Okie doke. Here we go, so slide number 4 looks like a slide which has escaped my secretary's mania for using smart art. So conflict of interest management strategies, it's very, very similar. As I said, it's just a slightly different organization's way of looking at it, and you'll see that they all use lots of R's there as well. So number 1 here is register. Please note this stuff's all in the book. So register here is the fact that we have to register that there is a conflict of interest. So when we looked at the last slide, slide number 3, we called this disclosure. So once again, you have this idea where you have some disclosure form to fill out, and you will either do that periodically every 6 or 12 months, or you will do it every time a conflict of interest arises, but we must register the fact that there is a conflict of interest. Fairly straightforward, I think. Right, restrict. With restrict, what's happening, therefore, is we get this idea of disqualification or monitoring and modification. So with restrict, what's happening is that, assuming I am working for the government, therefore will restrict my actions in terms of certain contracts. So if I am going to be purchasing goods from a company where my son works, then they will be monitoring, they will be making sure that the price is an arm's length price, that there's nothing funny going on with the price. They'll make sure that there is competitive tender process, or they will more strictly, in the words restrict, they will just stop me having anything to do with it. So I will not have access to any of the documents. I will not be able to tell my son who is dealing with it, how much money certain companies are bidding, and so on and so forth. So we get this idea of restrictions over me. Recruit. So recruit is the idea that this is such a big contract and there's such a problem with the perception of me that the government will go out and will recruit a temporary member of staff or a consultant or someone to undertake my job in terms of this particular contract. So we are recruiting someone who will replace me, hopefully just for a couple of weeks while we go through the tender process. So this wasn't actually on slide number 3, so this is a new one here. But we bring in a consultant, or I suppose potentially a full-time employee, and that full-time employee will take over those parts of my job which I can't be seen to be doing because of conflicts of interest. So that's recruit. Right, remove ties back into the thing I talked about with restrict, so we could probably just have included it under restrict, and it's the idea that they remove me. Now here what's actually happening is that they are removing me from the process. So the difference between remove and the last one, which is resign, is that with remove I am moved temporarily. So I go on gardening leave or go on holiday, or I move to another department, but I can't have anything to do with the overall process. The final one, resign, was the one that we called severance of relationships. So because of the conflict of interest, I therefore need to get myself out of the organization and I'm off. You have to be really careful of that in real life, because what happens is you'll find that certain government officials will simply go across to the supplier and they'll tell the supplier what to do to win the contract, and then you find 6 months later that they come back again. So we've got this idea of remove and resign, removed from the process, resign, removed from the organization, and restrict where I'm restricted in terms of what I can do. The one that we've missed out in the list is number 245, which is relinquish, and relinquish is the one that we call divestiture in slide number 3. I like relinquish much easier to say with my teeth. With relinquish, therefore, if you'll remember slide number 3, we own some shares in the supplier company, and what's happening, therefore, is that we are getting rid of the shares. And by getting rid of the shares, we remove the conflict of interest. So we have register, which is the same as disclosure. There seems to be no training here, which is unusual. Restrict, where they restrict what I can do. Recruit, they recruit a temporary person to replace me. Remove, they build a wall around me so I can have nothing to do with this. Relinquish, this is where I have something which creates the conflict of interest. Shares in a company, very popular, a very common one. So I get rid of those shares, and resign is the severance of relationship. They get rid of me. Okay, 3 and 4, very, very similar. But I would have to say the one thing that is missing there in slide number 4, which I only just realized now I've been through these, is that there's no training. I think you should always have training. If you do end up doing this in real life, put training in. We offer training, by the way. Okay, so slide number 5 here in part number 2. This is a very, very general slide. I wanted to give you some kind of guidance on what to actually do when you're writing these policies. Obviously, 21st century with the internet, what most people do is they start with someone else's policies and then kind of change and perfect them. So I don't think there's so much really that you're going to learn here. But in terms of structure of your report and the structure of the document itself, do take into consideration these ideas. Remember this idea of the possible conflict, whether it's actual, perceived, or potential. It is a big, big thing in real life. People who are involved in fraud and corruption tend to be investigators, and they only ever see one type of person. So please remember that 99% of the people who find themselves in these situations through no fault of their own, and they're not looking to steal money or anything. So take into account, therefore, whether it's potential, perceived, or actual. In potential, where you have the situation when it's going to arise all the time, and we had this. I used to work for, I can tell you, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So we had all of these audit clients. So we had audit clients like British Airways saying, well, do you want cheap flights for your staff and things like that? That kind of situation for PricewaterhouseCoopers, where there is the potential, is going to happen all the time. So they need, therefore, to have a very, very tight conflict of interest, policy, strategy, documents, and so on, because it's going to be used so commonly, and it's so easy to see how it can happen. When we move on to perceived, you need to look at what the risk is really of reputational risk. Again, if you're the United Nations, you cannot be constantly being accused of corruption. Now, corruption unfortunately happens everywhere, so the United Nations can never be completely clean. But because of the nature of the organization, they have to be seen to be above corruption. And finally, actual. Once you get into actual, well, you have to look and see what people are actually up to. Hopefully, at that point, you live in a country where there's laws and you just hand the whole thing over to the police and let them get on with it. Because people are stealing your money. And okay, maybe it's not your money if you work for a company, but it's the money of the company. It affects people's pay rises. It affects dividends to the shareholders. And it affects everything about the company as well. And let's be honest, who the hell wants to work for some dirty company that pays bribes or whatever? So look at those three things, and you have to take the perspective of the organization that you're in. Governments, again, if you're a procurement department, enormous potential for corruption, enormous potential for bribes, and enormous potential for conflicts of interest as well. Secondly, take into account whether it's financial or non-financial. I have to say that when you see these things, nearly all of them are financial. If they're not directly financial, there tends to be a financial angle. In other words, people are doing this because they want your friendship, because they know their department's going to be closed down in 2 years, or they're going to be looking for a promotion. So they want to be able to shake your hand and say, hey, we're friends, so something happens in the future. Or they want, their son to get a job in a particularly prestigious department. So I would say financial comes into it. And if there's non-financial in there, and it does happen. I mean, we've certainly had instances in the past where not just conflicts of interest. People have stolen money and they've given the money to charity because they hate the company that they work for, and they gain nothing from it themselves. But in general, they will be there. So take into consideration and see what people's motivations are. But if you're corrupt, basically. Assess the importance of the competing interests. Well, if you gain virtually nothing, then the chances of you doing something are virtually nothing. So at what point do you start removing people and hiring consultants? If the chance is very, very small, or the sums of money, you're buying a couple of thousand textbooks a year, so wow, you could get to steal $300 or something. Is it really possible? As I said, these are guidelines that were given to us, and take into consideration the personality of the public servant in question. Now, there's an interesting one, isn't there? Taking into consideration the personality of the public servant. Generally, that you are qualified, able, and would want to start making judgment calls on the personality of a public servant is rather doubtful, unless that person has something concrete, such as a conviction for corruption in the past. So I would be a little bit careful about that one. Made its way onto the slide though, and an interesting topic, isn't it? Let's just have a talk about your personality. Finally, choose a strategy to preserve public trust. I mean, this is what you're really trying to do. And most politicians, at the end of the day, most politicians are, I guess, obvious phrase, are politicians. What they're really looking for is popularity and re-election. That often is much more important than money to them. So therefore, in that sense, gaining public trust is good for them. And if it's a government, you certainly want to do that. Losing public trust, once again, if you're a private company, how many law firms have the public trust, I wonder. For the government, much more important. Okay, those are the kind of things that you're going to have to bear in mind. You have a slide on it, which is in part 1, which hopefully you've seen, so have a read of the slide, and you can use those as headings in your report. Do be careful about personality of public servants. Okay, so the summing up. In terms of teaching this as a subject, it's obviously much easier to teach than if you remember back a few years, we were doing derivatives and monitoring of the risk of derivatives. So it's obviously, as a technical subject, much easier than that. Where it becomes harder is that when you're monitoring derivatives, you set a kind of a threshold, and if you cross the threshold, you take action. If you don't, you don't. With conflicts of interest, it's much harder to get something clear in your head against which you can make judgment. So if you are doing this as a policy, I strongly recommend that you go and look and see what other people are doing, pull together the best of the best, and get some international best practice. I hope that these two things together have given you an idea of what conflict of interest is. I've tried to give you some little examples, and as I said, maybe we'll try to do some sort of conflicts of interest 3 and 4, where we do some actual concrete case studies to give you better ideas of where the grey areas are. But you should know now, and also particularly things like slide number 4 are very good, because you can see how when you're doing your policies, how what I want to call the punishment, if that's the right word, progresses. So we get the idea of to register, then we go to restrict, then we recruit, then we remove, then we relinquish, and then we resign. So you get this escalating situations, and so these escalating situations as we go through. Thanks very much, guys, for listening. I hope this is going to be interesting for you. We get some people who, when we do derivatives, and we did futures and options, they all kind of signed up. We've got some more people with the IPSAs now moving across into fraud and corruption. So maybe we'll get some new people. For those of you who've been around for a while, I hope this is interesting as well. We try to put up interesting topics for you. You know the stuff now. We're on Facebook. You can see this on YouTube. You all obviously know where the website is. We get however many 500, 1,000 hits every day on the website now. Download the training material. If you want all of the books and all of that kind of stuff, and you want it in Word so you can change it and use it as your own, then send me an email and I'll reply. And please, if any of you actually want us to come and do some training, the weather's so sad at the moment. I'm sitting here, it's Christmas and it's pouring with rain outside. If any of you are in Africa, for example, give me a call. We'll come and do some training for you in Africa. Get some nice weather. Haven't been to Africa for a couple of years now. Thanks, guys. If you're listening to this and it's before Christmas, have a great Christmas. If it's after Christmas, I hope you had a great Christmas and got all the presents that you want. Best of luck. Thank you very much.